Hello, everybody. My name is Benjamin Hart, and I've been doing these long form ones just over on my my personal page. Apparently, they do have an audience, and I very much appreciate the people that watch this stuff. It's just kind of me talking. It's almost kind of for my own benefit sometimes because I just like to organize my thoughts about what's going on in the world, or the world as I perceive it, I should say. And this video is going to be titled something along the lines of BRICS currency is not trying to be a new dollar. It's trying to be a perfected SDR. And that's what I think is going on. I just recently read a really good article by Alistair McLeod on his Gold Money platform. And I like everything he writes or talks about. He's an absolute, quite honestly, a colossus in the world of not only economics and banking, but also really a fascinating guy in terms of geopolitics, because at the end of the day, geopolitics is probably dictated by geoeconomics, and geoeconomics is just a matter of follow the money, and you'll kind of figure out what's going on basically in the real world. I mean, that's a simplistic way of putting it, but I don't think it's too far off the mark. The reason I thought of making this video is I watched a lot of stuff in the past week by people throughout the sort of gold bug community, what I call the liberty movement, what others call maybe the liberty movement, and then I've watched some folks sort of out there in the Bitcoin world. And the Bitcoin folks, if there was a Venn diagram of liberty movement, gold bugs, and Bitcoin, I don't know where exactly I sit in there. I don't sit very far into the meat of the circle of Bitcoin, if you will. I do have some Bitcoin. I'm sort of like Professor Dave Collum, where he says, he's not a hodler. He sort of is intrigued by it. He sees the possible benefit of it down the road. But for he himself, I think he said he wants to see guys walking off the battlefield bloodied, having won, before he's going to get in. And I sort of see where he's at. One thing I actually saw a recent podcast with him on there talking about how he just doesn't really want to get into Bitcoin. One exception I will make, and I made it in my personal life, is I do rather like Bitcoin, and I've been very comfortable with the notion of putting enough Bitcoin in to buy passage out of a given country. And that's born of actual personal observation. I remember when some stuff went down in Iran a few years ago, and there was a lot of people trying to get out of there. Bitcoin spiked. The price spiked a lot, and it was because there was demand for it, because people were trying to move capital and get out of a not particularly great situation. Similar circumstances I've seen happen more than once, actually, living in Southeast Asia. I've seen Chinese especially seeming to want to get away from mainland China, and they've used Bitcoin to do it. Now, whether that's the greatest thing in the world for huge amounts of capital, or whether, you just might want to hold on to some for purposes of, hey, I may just want to use this Bitcoin to be able to get a plane ticket the heck out of wherever. I kind of look at it as the latter, where I want a little bit of it, enough of it that I could do something with it, ostensibly at least, or presumably in the event of some kind of catastrophe or crisis or whatever. But again, I don't think you could call me a hodler by any stretch of the imagination. I certainly understand the argument. I do sometimes wonder if the sort of private crypto initiative wasn't sort of put out there as a kind of front-running, perhaps predictive programming to get people used to the notion of crypto. And then, as we've seen, the evolution of that is eventually central banks are going to get into that game, and I'll get into that in a minute. But so I don't really know to even satisfy my own self what the future of crypto is. And I also am not completely settled in my thoughts on it as far as if it's an overall good, bad, or indifferent thing. But I will say I'm very open-minded to it. But I do often wonder, if everybody was a gold person right at this moment, or had been going back a couple of years ago when all these various crises have sort of gone down, would the overall financial system, especially sort of the financial system as it emanates from the West, have been able to cope with that if people would have stampeded into gold rather than Bitcoin, as we saw, for example, in basically the years from about middle 20, I should say late summer of 20 going through 2021, where, you had a lot of bubbles going on. And I'm not saying Bitcoin per se was a bubble, but I'm saying there were a lot of bubbles going on. And, NFTs, for example, became a big thing. It was like, okay. So, and that kind of ran up its own little bubble and some things like that. Long story short, I often wonder if it wasn't some kind of a limited hangout or some sort of predictive programming to get people used to basically the cashless world. And I think there's some reason to presume that, that, for example, the fact that it's my understanding the NSA or the hash, if you will, was an NSA invention. That seems to be accepted wisdom at this point. So again, I often wonder what was the reasoning for the creation of this stuff. At the same time, I do know that a lot of really smart people that have inevitably worked for the government have actually ended up doing some great things for liberty and for freedom in the long term. In fact, more often than not, many innovations, are dual purpose, if you will. They're a double-edged sword. So leaving that aside, leaving the whole private crypto space aside, although I do think it's noteworthy that it's never a bad idea to particularly think about having maybe a little bit of a currency that could be used in a crisis. And Bitcoin looks to me like it has proven itself in chaotic times. Now, it hasn't proven itself up against the big sovereign players of the world if they want to legalize it or something like that. That remains to be seen. Although China has kind of gone back and forth about hammering down on it, and it's proven difficult to destroy. I mean, at the end of the day, there is something to it. You do have to give it credit for a certain amount of, if nothing else, the fact that as a medium of exchange, it's continued to survive for as long as it has. Now, that said, in terms of the lifespan, for example, is gold as not only as a commodity, but as money, I'm sorry, it just doesn't even compare. It's brand new. It's like comparing humanity to the lifespan of the entire earth. We've been here a millisecond, so to speak. So leaving that sort of aside, the thrust of this video I wanted to make has been, I've been watching all these different economists talking about the announcement from BRICS that in August they're going to put forward this new trade currency. It's possibly going to be gold-backed. The guys that I usually sort of grok with, as it were, for example, I really like Alistair McLeod. They sort of are of the opinion that, no, this is really serious. I think Jim Rickards has been pretty vocal about this as well, and I've always listened to him and read pretty much all of his books, except for the latest one because I can't get a copy of it, and I really do prefer to read paper. I don't like to read anything digitally, at least not long form. But the folks that are serious about macro understand what this stuff means, and they also get that when you look at this, you don't look at it in a yesterday, today, tomorrow. You look at this as 50 years ago, this 50 years, and the 50 years following that. And in terms of that analysis, that latter analysis, yeah, this is huge. This is huge news. But how much of an impact is it going to happen? Is it going to make in the relatively short term? Remains to be seen. But I have seen some folks who I really respect and admire that I think are either not fully seeing the scope of this, and I don't think it's necessarily their fault, and I don't think it's their lack of intellect. I think it's, to a certain extent, an amount of what you could call normalcy bias, or maybe just, in this case, location bias. Look, if you're in the United States, it's pretty hard to see the ramifications of this the way that one could see it sitting here in Thailand. Or if one were sitting in Argentina, or Uruguay, or Italy, or Turkey. Turkey's probably, Turks are probably sitting around looking at the world like, oh, wow, the Euro area probably has the same kind of biases, although not nearly as deeply entrenched, I imagine, as perhaps folks sitting in the dollar area. I suspect the British, especially those in the know within the city of London, are probably looking at this very analytically and understand that major changes are happening here. But one thing that I've noticed that seems to have been lost on folks, or they don't seem to be looking at this directly, is everybody keeps talking about de-dollarization, and I have been very careful in making it clear that I do not believe that that is what is happening. And I don't believe that that is what is happening for a variety of different reasons, one of which is I don't think you can fully get rid of the dollar area. If we do go into some multipolar world in a currency sense, there is going to be a dollar area, and it's going to be vast. It's been said that any country that has a coastline effectively borders the United States. That's your dollar area. That no matter how you cut it, in probably the next decade minimum, there's still going to be a dollar area based on maritime trade. And even in Mr. McLeod's recent article I was reading, he even noted that presumably this BRICS currency system, in whatever form it manifests itself in, is going to, at least initially, and probably for a fair period of time, going to have commodities and things denominated in both this new thing as well as the dollar itself, because it doesn't just go away overnight, for one thing. And as I said a moment ago, look, the United States is going to remain a major maritime power and a major air power. I think it remains safe to pretty well conclude that from a geopolitical standpoint, any country with a coastline effectively borders the United States. That's a lot of the world. Now, Eurasia and this consolidation of the Eurasian landmass and the consolidation of the Eurasian economies and the Eurasian state jurisdictions and this sort of partnership, if you will, between Russia and China, especially economically, yes, these are going to be major changes, and those are going to happen on the landmass of Eurasia pretty well away from American direct influence, I think, or Western. Let's call it Western. Again, it's not, it's as Carol Quigley called it, the Anglo-American establishment. That's a pretty fair statement. But then you got to add the EU in there. I always kind of like the way Orwell looked at it, and I'm not trying to be Orwellian. I just like the way he looked at the world geopolitically, where there was a Eurasia, East Asia, and Oceania. And, honestly, that was probably a pretty fair assessment in the reality of geopolitics back then, just as much as it's a pretty fair assessment now. But on the landmass of Eurasia, we're going to see a lot of activity. In fact, the Wild East is kind of moved from, in my opinion, East Asia over to West Asia, Western Asia, that place where sort of China hooks up into sort of what becomes the Middle East, or Russia hooks into the stands through the Caucasus, the Caucasus, down through those mountains, down through sort of below the Black Sea, all of those areas. Again, I think Turkey's going to be very important. It's been interesting to watch. Turkey's been making a lot of moves geopolitically, getting a lot of concessions and things for just making deals, basically, and I suspect Turkey will continue to do that. In fact, I think in the book, The Next 100 Years, Turkey was mentioned as one of the major probable players in terms of geopolitics moving through the next 100 years. A lot of those predictions, I think, were not particularly on point, and I don't think will ultimately come to fruition. But some of them were very astute. In any event, or at least in my mind, they were. In any event, so you sort of let's start with the presumption that this is not de-dollarization. That's not exactly what's even going on, and I'll get to that in a moment. But that's not even that any of the players even think that could happen that way, like where the dollar just disappears. No, it's not going to work like that. Now, there could be substantial pressure and stress on the dollar. That I don't think there is any doubt. And in fact, the dollar is going to go through some very turbulent times. But do I think it's going to disappear entirely? Or more, should I say the dollar area, if you will, the way that we used to use the term pound area. Do I think that's going to disappear? No, not so much. But what it looks like remains to be seen. I actually think it's going to go through a really bad clip of time and come out on the other end far more resilient. When America, the United States specifically, but the West as well, the greater West, comes to its senses and gets back to being what she's traditionally been, which is a bastion of free enterprise and a bastion of, quite honestly, liberty. But it's going to be a while before we get there. And it's going to go through, again, some turbulence while we do. The thrust of this video, though, and the point, I really think where people are missing the point with regard to the notion of this BRICS trade currency is, one, it's a trade currency. This is not set up, and nor does it appear to be planned to be set up, to replace any currency as we know the term currency at the street level. And I'll call this the street level, being able to just pull bills out of your pocket and, pull money out. Well, I don't have any money in either of these pockets. Pull money out of these pockets and go buy something. Go downstairs here for me and buy a pineapple off the street from a street vendor here in Bangkok, or go up the road a little bit, walk into a Burger King, pay cash for a cheeseburger, come back home, eat it, stay there, eat it, whatever. It's not what this is. It's not a currency like that. It's a trade currency. This is why I think the title of this video will probably be, they're not trying to create a new dollar. They're trying to create a perfected SDR. That's what it looks like to me. And first off, you got to understand what the SDR is. So the SDR stands for the special drawing right. And the SDR is a creation, if you will, of primarily what is up to this time been known as the international banking system, what may very soon be called the Western banking system. But it's a creation of the IMF. And what you have to understand about it is it's only really used by central banks. Again, the SDR is not designed for people on the street level to use it. It's not a currency that's going to have denominated bills on the street, at least not yet, nor have I ever seen anything that warrants thinking that was ever really the plan. Again, I've always looked at it as like General Motors back in the day, back in its heyday especially. There was General Motors, and then it had multiple brands. So, Chevrolet, GMC, Cadillac. I think some years ago, Oldsmobile was a GM thing. I think Buick. I don't know if Buick's still around. I believe Buick's a GM brand. Pontiac, I think, was a GM brand. Again, same car company, different brands. Everything's slightly different. Looking at the way I look at the SDR, at least at present, and the way I'm thinking the BRICS currency is going to play out, trade currency, is, again, okay, there's the SDR, which is like corporate General Motors, and then the dollar is sort of a brand of that. The pound is a brand of that. The euro even is a brand of that. The yuan, which is allowed, presently it's sort of in the basket of currencies that pertains to the SDR. The Chinese yuan is in there. These are examples of that. But then to create new SDRs, these countries have to come together in a committee, which the United States presently has effective veto power over based on how the makeup of that committee works. But they meet up in a committee, and each one has a vote which is proportional to essentially kind of a metric of how much they make up for global trade, or more specifically, their currency makes up for global trade. For example, Britain is still sitting in there with the pound, which at first glance you'd say, well, the British economy in terms of world trade. Well, can't look at it like that. City of London, the pound area remains a thing. They do, as a currency, still kind of, quote unquote, punch above their weight, if you will. So they meet in a committee to decide if they want to issue a new tranche of SDRs. And each given country's central bank sort of kicks in whatever their proportion is in terms of their national currency into this SDR thing that can then be moved around from central bank to central bank, used as a drawing right against other currencies, against other central banks, but it sort of occurs, if you will, on a layer above just national banks and national bank currencies, national central banks and central bank currencies. And it, if you will, occurs behind or within the circle of these banks. If you view the central banks as sort of sitting in a circle, the SDR is in the middle of it, in the middle of that circle, and they can sort of push out their SDRs into the central banks in order to sort of fuel whatever growth or whatever ultimate purpose they want to fuel using those SDRs. So again, Now, the problem, probably from the Easterner's standpoint with respect to the SDR, is again the fact that the Americans have an effective veto power over the creation of new SDRs, which, again, as we discussed in another video prior to this one, in the Bretton Woods makeup, Bretton Woods, the flaw, if you will, not a flaw from the American standpoint. And again, I am not in favor of this stuff happening. I'm just kind of making these videos to clear it into my head and maybe to provide some insight to other folks as to what's going on. Because, look, the dollar dominance has been a massive boon to me on a personal level. I was born and raised in the United States. I moved abroad when I was relatively young, and I did a lot of business with a lot of Americans. I mean, that system has worked. I don't really want to watch it go away. Quite frankly, I'm hoping I make these videos to provide insight to people who might be able to figure out a way to maybe save the dollar at the end of the day. And I don't think it's doomed, honestly. I think it could be saved if sort of cooler heads and wiser brains would prevail, but remains to be seen. In any event, going back to the SDR, and if you go back to Keynes himself, when discussing Bretton Woods, Keynes hypothecated the notion of a bancor, which was this sort of, it very much is the SDR. Again, it's this sort of bankers' markers, if you will, between themselves, the central bankers' markers between themselves to sort of deal with possible liquidity issues and to sort of prop each other up, if you will. It very much is, it's a cartel kind of system, basically. They help each other because failure to, it's sort of, we either hang together or we hang separately. Failure to do so would result in the whole thing just falling apart. So they have to cooperate. Now, again, the problem, again, from the Eastern perspective or the Eurasian perspective on this is much the same as the problem with the original Bretton Woods and then what came after Kissinger's deal in the 70s, which resulted in the petrodollar, which was one country, namely the United States, could print what was being used as a reserve currency sort of at will, the so-called exorbitant privilege, as Charles de Gaulle called it, that Americans could print it at will, and it still kind of had to be accepted because it was de facto had to be accepted in an international context. It does go deeper than that. As I discussed in the last video on Enbridge, this is also about infrastructure. It's not just about a currency or a piece of paper. It's about the infrastructure of SWIFT, and as we discussed, CPAM, SEPAM, which the Asian Clearing Union is apparently now starting to use, and then this new BRICS thing, and then Enbridge, where the nodes, Hong Kong, Thailand, Dubai, or UAE, I should say, act as the nodes that will connect what I believe will be the maritime sort of dollar area with the Eurasian BRICS area. And these nodes, I think, are being brought online to go ahead and deal with that effectively, act as clearinghouses to go ahead and do discounts and things between those two currencies. Very fascinating to watch that. I think that's going to be very beneficial for all three of those jurisdictions. In fact, I've been kind of a downer on Hong Kong for a while. I'm starting to kind of wonder if I need to be making a U-turn on my thinking on Hong Kong, if only purely in the economic sense. Let's be clear, you know, I'm not talking politically, just economically. So, again, going back to what I was saying here, this Bancor and this SDR, they have the same problems from the standpoint of the East, which is, look, these folks that don't particularly seem to have our interests all the time at heart can print this thing as and when they need. And as Alistair McLeod says it, they use that printing function to fund government deficits, so-called guns and butter, as LBJ called it. So they don't want that. So they're going to, in my opinion, again, they're not trying to create or replicate the dollar. They're trying to create what people have been talking about the SDR could be, but they want to do it on their terms. That's what it looks like to me. And their terms will likely mean, because you're looking at a situation not completely unanalogous, by the way, to the situation that France and Germany were in when they were first forming the EU, where they were sort of the anchors for various reasons. One was sort of the agricultural country. The other was the industrial country. Also, the history there, they were countries that were constantly a lot of friction between the two. Not saying it's a complete apples to apples comparison, but China and Russia sitting on the landmass of Eurasia don't look too far off, with one being a sort of source of things that come out of the ground. Maybe not agriculture necessarily per se, although Russia is an agricultural producing state, and depending on the way Ukraine goes, that could result in being the breadbasket of a new Eurasia, depending on how that all plays out. And I have no idea how that's all going to play out. Mr. Ritter has been talking, Ritter, and Colonel Douglas McGregor have been talking a lot on YouTube lately. They seem to know a thing or two. But that being said, I don't have a lot of experience or understanding about what's going on up there. I'm not going to comment on that further. Leaving that aside, though, an analogous relationship could come up. Leave aside agriculture. An analogous relationship could arise within this BRICS system, wherein Russia is the source of the natural resources. So oil and gas, for just that alone, energy. And then China is the industrial powerhouse. Again, it's France and Germany going into the EU writ large, if you look at it on a Eurasian-wide scale. So that is one way, in my opinion, to understand this stuff. And when you look at it in terms of BRICS, again, the big problem they've had is countries, specifically one country, being able to run deficits off of their ability to effectively, if you will, hijack the function that was designed to be the anchor in Bretton Woods and then to be something of an intermediary in the energy markets in terms of the petrodollar, to be able to use that at will, to kind of hijack it, that exorbitant privilege. That's the best way to put it. Hijack's the wrong word. Exorbitant privilege, as de Gaulle called it, to just print this mechanism at will and use it at will to do whatever you want. We've seen it. Now, the world kind of put up with that and was willing to put up with it because, for the most part, the U.S. didn't get too crazy about it. Then we started messing with the infrastructure, namely kicking people out of SWIFT, and we started messing with their reserves. For example, say what you will about the Ukrainian situation, the United States freezing Russia's, whatever it was, like $1 trillion in Russian reserves held in dollars, that was a bad move from the standpoint of continuing that infrastructure. Because everyone around the world is sitting there going, well, do we really want to be completely all in, if you will, to use a poker term, completely all in on this infrastructure? Or do maybe we want some other options? And clearly, as we've shown in some of these videos, the world is looking at some other options. That's just a fact. So the point I'm trying to make with this video, though, is to get people to realize that perhaps it's not a matter of looking at this as a de-dollarization or as even trying to exactly be a competitor with the dollar. Although on a certain level, maybe that is correct in terms of the dollar's infrastructure. Because when you think of the dollar, you think of the currency itself. Then you have to think of things like SWIFT and the infrastructure associated with the liquidity of the bond market, for example, and how the sort of Chinese-American trade situation works with regard to treasuries and how that all sort of factors in. The treasury sort of feedback loop that you get into with Saudi Arabia, if you go back and look at the petrodollar. Again, that's infrastructural more than just looking at the currency. But so again, they're looking for alternatives. Other jurisdictions are kind of saying, hey, would kind of be nice to have a Betamax to the VHS, to have an alternative maybe under these circumstances, to use a really old term for video players back in the day, for video recordation device. But maybe we want to have, if we're running a restaurant and all we can get is Coca-Cola, and Coca-Cola decides to unilaterally turn off the tap of Coca-Cola, maybe you want to start looking around for Pepsi or Fanta, or I guess that's Coca-Cola, or here in Thailand, EST, or some other maybe alternative, because you don't want to be running a restaurant where, suddenly there's no soft drinks in your restaurant, or beer for that matter, a pipeline of a certain kind of beer. Use the same analogy. I mean, that's just commonsensical. People are just going to do that. If it looks like there could be tenuousness with regard to one's ability to use a particular medium of exchange, you're going to at least look around for other options. And that sort of brings me to sort of I'm hoping will be the conclusion. I know I have a tendency to just drone on, but again, this is looked at as an alternative for central banks. They're not going to change their national currencies. Yes, it has a CBDC element to it because it's primarily probably going to be digitized, and I expect it'll be very fast in terms of major trade functions. It will be able to move rather quickly. Not at the outset. I suspect there's going to be a ton of kinks that they have to work out, but ultimately down the line, I think it will get rather quickly, not to be redundant. But the thing to understand, to my mind, and I think something folks are missing, is that when we say trade currency, that's a very different thing than just sort of a national currency. And more importantly, what I think they're trying to do is, again, create something that is SDR-like, but that is perfected, if you will, from their perspective, which is no one player can unilaterally print a bunch more of it. So in essence, again, I've said this before, it will end up being a tabulator of gold probably among these nations, among these trade nations, where goods and services move between these jurisdictions, and then on a monthly basis, quarterly basis, yearly basis, whatever, the central banks come together and say, okay, tally up what we've moved around the board. What do I owe you? What do you owe me in terms of gold? And we see where we stand, but they use that trade currency as that tabulator. And again, this allows no one person to just create the underlying value out of thin air. Value I put in question marks, or quotation marks, I should say. So that's sort of how I'm looking at it, is what they're trying for is an SDR-like system, an SDR-like infrastructure that they control, that no one person or no one jurisdiction will have total control over. Now, that being said, it's going to be interesting to watch, because as much as especially the sort of alternative Western press seems to be making it look like, oh, China and Russia are monolithic, they're not really. Their relationship is not in a historical sense a real chummy one. It's how Nixon was able to triangulate them, and quite honestly, it's how it's been a mistake in my mind to drive them together. I mean, we should have inverted the Nixon doctrine in my mind and been more cozy and friendly with Russia and kind of distanced from China. And we, I mean America in this sense, geopolitically, and I'm talking purely academically here. To my mind, just in sort of a game theory way of looking at it, we would have been better off tacking a little more toward Russian wind, continuing to do business with China, but just kind of saying, hey, we got other friends too, and just moving forward. No, but instead we drove them together for a variety of different reasons, and now we're in the situation we're in, and now they're deciding to have this sort of alternative trade currency, which I don't think they really want. I don't think they really want to go through what'll probably be a rather tumultuous initial period of bringing it up online. It won't be perfect. You'll see a bunch of mistakes I'm sure will get made as they sort of figure out, the problems in the system. But I don't think it'll take a lot of time to get it up and going. It's basically just a matter of getting all the central bank guys in one room, or even their representatives, and saying, hey, this is what we're going to do. It's going to be an alternative thing. Again, they've mentioned it, as mentioned before. There will then end up being sort of a dual pricing system, dual denomination system, where trade will be denominated in this trade currency as well as possibly dollars. And then moving forward, we're going to see, what that looks like in practice in terms of international trade. And as I've said before, I think it's going to be a pretty turbulent time for all parties. I don't think that, sitting on Eurasia, you're going to be it'll be like a frog on a lily pad in a calm pond or something. No, I think everybody's going to go through a lot of what I call churn. When things start to churn, there's going to be a lot of churn, and it's going to be really surreal for all of us. But long story short, again, as I've said before, I think ultimately this will result in a massive industrial boom for Eurasia. It's going to be a very tumultuous transition, I think, for the West. I think the United States in particular is probably going to have a hard time, not necessarily out of the substance of the problem, but more from the shock of the realization, because I don't think folks, especially there, fully realize the magnitude of this. Although, quite honestly, the rest of the West is, I think, going to be just as blindsided, honestly. That said, I think it's wrong to look at this as purely a move against the dollar per se. I think it's better to look at this as trying to engineer an alternative and perhaps, again, in their mind, a perfected version of the SDR system to be utilized primarily by the sovereign nations in Eurasia to do business and to move major capital, major energy commodities, and major trade. I think that's ultimately what they're going for. So it'll be interesting to watch. And again, I kind of make these videos more to sort out my own thoughts in my own head. And to those of you that do watch, I really appreciate it. I don't know what I'm going to do with this channel at this point. I just kind of enjoy making these videos. It kind of relaxes me from time to time. And I don't really have a set schedule of when I'm going to make them. I'll just keep making them. And if you folks are interested or you like them or whatever, I always appreciate comments. I do like to interact with people over here. And thanks a lot for watching, I guess. And we'll see you later.